Welcome to the 15th lecture of the MOOC course on Sociological Perspectives on Modernity. Till now, we have covered 3 modules: thematic preliminaries, so classic statements about sociological modernism through the works of Karl Marx and Max Weber, then the structuralist interpretation of critical modernist paradigm in sociology through the works of Levi-Strauss and Louis Althusser. And it is the 4th module that we are going to discuss in this 15th lecture. We will in another 2 or 3 lectures we are going to cover this module, that society as a human creation. I mean, what are the views of, or what are the views from Western Marxist trajectory, theoretical trajectory, that we will see. I think it is fair to say that there is not an agreed definition of Western Marxism. In the same way that the phrase new left can be used to refer to radically different political developments, often depending largely on the speaker's own point of view and whether they treat the phrase as a compliment or an insult, because they will people will brand them as they are deviating from Marxism itself, or they are deviating from what Marx said, or they will be insulted that perhaps they have not understood the writings of Marx properly. I am not going to do that. I am just trying to look at different theoretical trajectories. Okay. And in this case, so far as the critical modernist paradigm in sociology are concerned, I am going to discuss the Western Marxist theoretical trajectory and its contributions to modernity, again through the lenses of holism or totality, reflexivity, rationality and social movements, through the works of 3 very important prominent thinkers, namely Georg Lukács, Antonio Gramsci and Alan Turing. When I said, I think it is fair to say that there is not an agreed definition of Western Marxism, I mean in the same way that the phrase new left can be used to refer to radically different political developments, often depending largely on the speaker's own point of view, own perspective, and whether they treat the phrase as a compliment or an insult. The phrase Western Marxism can be used to refer to very different sets of theories according to one's preferences and purposes, according to one perspective. So far as the perspective of this course is concerned, I am going to define Western Marxism negatively in terms of approaches which differ significantly from the major forms of Marxism that became institutionalized in the Leninist and Social Democratic parties of the pre-war period, and positively in terms of reworkings of the Marxist tradition which emphasize the activist, humanist and emancipatory elements in his thought. It implies, this means locating Western Marxism in terms of agency rather than structure. In terms of structure, we have discussed the works of Levi-Strauss and Althusser in the case of structuralist interpretation of modernity. But in this case, we are going to locate Western Marxism not in terms of structure, but in terms of agency, in terms of the conventional distinction, or in terms of critique rather than science, in terms of Goldner's terminology. If somebody wants to raise, we will address this question later on. But this is not the purpose of this course. Okay, that Alvin's terminology, Alvin Goldner's terminology. In terms of this course, we can treat structuralism and Western Marxism as the opposing developments of different emphases within classic modernism. One element of this can be seen in terms of the concept of determinism. When I say this, I mean, let me go back a little when both Marx and Weber emphasize the extent to which people's action is determined by their social situation. Marx's famous phrase for this is human beings make their own history, but not under conditions of their own choosing. Human beings make their own history, but they do not make it under the circumstances chosen by themselves. Okay? I mean, the tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living. Why I refer to this, and I say that no, the structuralism and Western Marxism are the opposing developments of different emphases within classic modernism, because structuralism emphasizes on structure and not agency, whereas Western Marxism emphasizes more on agency, not structure, human agency. Okay? Okay. I mean, structuralism develops the emphasis on the primary role of social relations to argue that the idea of human agency is an illusion. That is why structuralists said the individual ceases to exist. What we know, it is not human agency. What we actually know is the relational. That is why structuralism develops the emphasis on the primary role of social relations to argue that the idea of agency, human agency, is an illusion. This can be described as a strong determinism, or perhaps more clearly as a variant of fatalism. A weak determinism would see determination as setting limits and exerting pressures. In the Western Marxist tradition, the setting of limits and exerting of pressure on human action is above all the result of the action of other human beings or ourselves in the past. This is very important. In the Western Marxist tradition, okay, such kind of setting of limits and exerting of pressure on human action is the result of the action of other human beings or of ourselves in the past. That is why I said the tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living, as Marx wrote. Putting it succinctly, if we take the idea of the determination of human action by social structure as characteristic of classic modernism, we could say that structuralism collapses human action back into social structure, whereas Western Marxism tends to collapse social structure back into human action. What structuralists argued earlier, I mean in the last lectures what we have discussed, human agency has no role to play. It is a structure which is going to determine our social action. I mean human agency. Okay? I mean in structuralism, structuralism collapses human action back into social structure, while Western Marxism tends to collapse social structure back into human action. I mean Western Marxists, namely Lukács, Gramsci and Turenne, they tend to place human action on a higher pedestal, or human agency on a higher pedestal vis-a-vis social structure, in relation to social structure. Okay. Okay. These are the three, in this lecture, in this module, I will be talking about three authors, as I have already mentioned: Georg Lukács, Antonio Gramsci and Alain Touraine, mainly because I think there is a relatively similar logic in their theory. This is not an obligatory definition. Of course, as Martin J. in Marxism and Totality, for example, includes Althusser in his discussion of Western Marxism. Roger Gottlieb's anthology includes socialist feminist authors. Both of these are admittedly slightly unusual choices, but virtually any definition of Western Marxism would also include the authors of the Frankfurt School, I mean the critical theory, namely Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, Erich Fromm, Herbert Marcuse and so on, but I've deliberately avoided them in these lectures, but they have of course made a substantial contribution in terms of theorizing modernity and rationality in particular. I will be talking about Jürgen Habermas, for example. He also belongs to the Western Marxist school. I mean the one of the second generation of the Frankfurt School or the critical school, and I mean the participants, I mean all of you are welcome to read up on the other critical theorists if you want to write about them apart from their own writings and books devoted to them, both Martin J. And Roger Gottlieb include them. It's worth spending a couple of minutes on the context that these authors are writing in. I always why I am giving you this prefatory remark on Western Marxist perspectives on critical modernism, that please do not think that only these three, I mean Lukács, Gramsci and Turenne, only they have contributed to the domain of modernity, but why I am trying to restrict because of certain categorical imperatives of this course, and not only that, but also other theorists more or less, okay, they can be clubbed here through the writings of these three authors. Okay. That is, okay. Lukács, Gramsci and Turenne are important, and all other theorists are important, but I am also trying to look at why I selected all only these three, not others, precisely because how I can examine critical modernist paradigm in sociology through the lenses of these four elements, four central philosophical and political foundations of modernity, namely holism or totality, reflexivity, rationality and social movements. Okay. In this sense, we are going to discuss the contributions made by Western Marxists, namely Georg Lukács, Antonio Gramsci and Alain Turenne to the critical modernist paradigm in sociology. Okay? That is why I said it is worth spending a couple of minutes on the context that these authors are writing in. The relevant writings of Lukács and Gramsci, the relevant writings of Lukács and Gramsci date from the interwar period. I mean, when I say interwar period, I mean the period between the First World War and the Second World War. So, they predate in fact structuralism by a few decades. Lukács was a Hungarian communist. His most important book for our purposes, I mean History and Class Consciousness, was written after his involvement in the Hungarian Revolution of 1919, and Gramsci was involved in the Workers' Council movement during the Turin strikes in the same period. I mean Lukács was from Hungary, Gramsci was from Italy. Okay? And Gramsci's theoretical reputation largely derives from his prison notebooks written in a deliberately elliptical fashion because of censorship and smuggled out of jail. In fact, Gramsci was jailed in 1925 till 1938, and during the period in jail he wrote prison notebooks. Both I mean in other words, um, both of them, both Lukács as well as Gramsci, share an experience of practical politics at a level which can be described in terms of the social totality, as well as an experience which leads them both to emphasize that social knowledge and social action are not separate forms of life. I mean, there was a refusal to separate theory from practice, that social knowledge and social action, theory and practice, knowledge and social movements, political movements, they are inseparable. That is about, I mean Lukács and Gramsci. Okay. When you look at Alain Tourain's life is a bit more prosaic. He is a French sociologist, okay, but one whose research program has led him into involvement with a broad range of social movements, from investigating the experience of car workers at Renault in the 1950s, through involvement with the student movement in 1968 in France, to research on Allende's Chile and the anti-nuclear movement in France. Okay. Then through these three authors, we will be able to know the reflections from three countries: Hungary, Italy and France, okay, Western Marxist trend. Okay. Then what is the commonality that we find? There is a common thread of involvement with social movements, okay, because in Hungary, okay, Lukács was very much involved in Hungarian Revolution of 1919. In Italy, Gramsci was very much involved in the workers' council movements during the Turin strikes in 1919, 20 and so on. Okay. And in France, Tourain was engaged in Tourain was investigating the experience of car workers at Renault in the 1950s. He was also involved with the students' movements in 1968 in France. He was also involved in anti-nuclear movements in France. Okay. That is why they were, all these three, Lukács, Gramsci and Tourain, they were very much involved in social and political movements. And there was also a refusal to separate theory from practice. Having made these prefatory remarks, now let us see the concept of totality and how Western Marxism has contributed to the debates on modernity, the debates on critical modernist paradigm in sociology. How in the case of I mean, what are the implications so far as reification, alienation, expressive totality and so on are involved in this. Okay. It is very important, okay, to know. When I say the concept of totality, I'll just let us start with Western Marxism and structuralism. I'm not going to dwell much on structuralism, but I'm trying to look at Western Marxism as an opposing trend to structuralism. Western Marxism, of course, shares with structuralism a common emphasis on holism or totality, or the concept of totality. This is formulated by Lukács as the all-pervasive supremacy of the whole over the parts. I mean, social structure is a product of all human actions, all human agencies. In this sense, Lukács said that we must understand the all-pervasive supremacy of the whole, I mean the social structure over the parts, namely human action or human agency. In this way, both the major developments of critical modernist paradigm in sociology reject methodological individualism propounded by Weber in favor of a view of the social whole as essentially relational, although as we shall see the content of these relations of course differs drastically, dramatically. In each case, in the case of structuralism and in the case of Western Marxism, it is this relational approach or it is this relationalism that enables us to think of a social whole. An example from the Western Marxist tradition would be the concept of class. This is seen as representing not an individual fact, so that A is a shopkeeper and B is a peasant, but a relation. So that C stands in a relation of exploitation and domination of D. Okay? This is again different. This is again different from what Marx said. Okay? It is, but Marx also was very quick and incisive enough to mention the role of the role of so many subsidiary and intermediary classes. Okay? Okay? This is and this is how Western Marxists studied the notion of class, that class is seen as representing, then representing what? Not an individual fact, but a relation. As well as this strong relationalism, there is a radical extension of the category of the social. Like structuralism, or at least like Althusser's structuralism, but unlike the classical modernism of Marx and Weber, Western Marxism tends to treat the social as the primary or even the only reality. This is clear in terms of the concept of human nature. What is that? Now, the idea of a biologically fixed, universally present human nature is rejected as firmly by Gramsci as by Althusser, and we have seen that Levi-Strauss does not take this approach. Okay. Here again, the substance of, the substance of Western Marxism's alternative, social agency, is radically different from that of structuralism. More broadly, the idea of nature as separate from and essentially different to society is rejected. Okay? This is very important. In structuralism, it was not. Structuralism, social structure, nature, they were more important. Okay? But in the case of Western Marxism, the social agency, the idea of nature, I will not look at agency now, but the idea of nature as separate from and essentially different to society is rejected. For example, for Lukács, it is effectively unknowable. Nature, the idea of nature is unknowable. For Gramsci, nature is something that is effectively completely subordinated to society in the process of production. Similarly, both reject the idea of the unconscious as having an independent and pre-social nature. This is not just a rejection of the idea of the non-social, it is also bound up with a rejection of positivistic and scientistic approaches to social reality, and the insistence that we cannot claim to stand outside of history to be an external observer of a fixed or given reality. When I have used the term scientistic, scientistic means where everything is reduced to science. Okay? There is a difference between scientific and scientistic. Okay? Okay? Marx believed, for example, Marx believed in scientific studies, not scientistic studies. Okay? Okay? Okay. philosophers of science, historians of science, sociologists of science, we always try to study, we always try to make scientific studies, not scientistic studies. Okay? That we always try to interrogate the idea of whatever changes have occurred, okay, can be reduced to only scientistic explanations. No, we aim at scientific explanation. Okay? We do not believe in a reductionist method. Okay? This is, but the central argument here is that for Georg Lukács, it is nature is effectively unknowable. We can know nature only through human action, human agency. For Gramsci, nature is something that is effectively completely subordinated to society in the process of production. I mean nature is always controlled by human agency. Okay? I mean, earlier notion was that nature controls, human beings only know how to contemplate on nature. But earlier also Marx said this, but Gramsci put it in a different way, that human beings not only contemplate on nature, but also know how to control nature. That is how there was a shift from faculty of contemplation to faculty of control. Okay? Then if when I say, when Gramsci says that nature is something that that is effectively completely subordinated to society in the process of production, there is a difference between Lukács and Gramsci. Okay? The difference is that for Lukács, nature is effectively unknowable, but for Gramsci, nature is knowable, but nature is completely subordinated to society, human agency, human action in the process of production. But then what is the similarity? The similarity is that both Lukács and Gramsci reject the idea of the unconscious as having an independent and pre-social nature. This is not this is not merely a rejection of positivistic and scientistic approaches to social reality and the insistence that we cannot claim to stand outside of history to be an external observer of a fixed and given reality. If we want to know history, if we want to understand history, if we want to change history, then we must engage ourselves with our history, with society, with culture, with economy, with polity and so on. Okay? We cannot be an external observer, we cannot be external observers of a fixed and given reality, because nothing is fixed or given. Everything is changing, everything is dynamic. Okay? This is very important. Okay. Now I hope now you know the difference between one, structuralism and Western Marxism, okay, and where both Lukács as well as Gramsci, they share some commonality in the context of the concept of totality or holism as a central philosophical and political foundation of critical modernist paradigm in sociology. The way both Lukács as well as Gramsci, they reject the idea of the unconscious as having an independent and pre-social nature. Why? How? If such question arises, okay, then this is not just a rejection of the idea of the non-social, it is also bound up with a rejection of positivistic and scientistic approaches to social reality. Further, both Lukács as well as Gramsci, okay, insisted that one cannot claim to stand outside of history, one cannot afford to be an external observer of a fixed or given reality. Okay? In this sense, what we have covered till now is that we have discussed the difference, in in this section on the concept of totality or holism, we have discussed the differences between or opposing trends between structuralism on the one hand and Western Marxism on the other. Okay. And then we have discussed on what count both Lukács as well as Gramsci share their opinions. Okay. In the context of holism or totality. Okay. We are still in holism or totality. If we have to look at this, that we cannot be isolated from historical contingencies. Okay. For Western Marxist authors, society also is a human creation, because they drew upon the works of Marx. More exactly, humanity is nothing but social humanity, because humanity, human beings are not isolated individuals. That is why they refer to what Marx said, human beings make their own history, but not as isolated individuals. Human beings only appear as human beings in interaction with one another. That is what Rousseau also said in social contract theory, that man becomes man only among men. He was referring to a human being becomes a human being only among other human beings. If you put a human being in a forest, then without having any opportunity to interact with other human beings, then that human being will turn out to be an isolated category. That human being may interact with only animals or birds, will not be able to learn the language, will not be able to understand human culture and so on. Okay. That is what Rousseau said in social contract theory. What Western Marxists suggest that human beings only appear as human beings in interaction with one another, that is in social relations of production. And these social relations of production nevertheless are not fixed or given, they are ever changing. So that we could discuss them in terms of structures which define what appear to be individuals, rather they are the results of collective creation and social conflicts. That is why these social relations of production ultimately are the results of collective creation and social conflict. Thus, whatever appears as natural, given or fixed in society is the result of human action, but we do not recognize it as such. In this context, Lukács introduces the term reification. Okay. The term reification is very close to Marx's discussion on alienation, where let me give you an example where I say that in the industrial mode of production, human beings turn out to be machines. Human beings are reduced to machines. When they are reduced to machines, they alienate from their own labor, okay, from their own self, from their own individuality. Okay. In this sense, that whatever appears to us as natural, given or fixed in society is the result of human action, but we do not recognize it as such. That I do not recognize the way in generality, we do not recognize the way human beings have turned out to be machines. Human beings have lost their essence. They are alienated from their own labor, they are alienated from their own work, they are alienated from their own self, they are alienated from their own individuality. Okay? They are alienated from their own creativity. If we do not recognize it as such, Lukács introduces the term called reification. What is reification? Reification refers to the process where the result of our actions appears to us as a quasi natural thing, because we do not recognize its social origins or the processes of creation that which have gone into their formation. We do not recognize, which appears to us as a quasi natural thing, only appearance. Quasi means semi natural thing, partially natural thing, but actually they are not natural. Nothing is in Western Marxist framework, nothing is natural, nothing is given, nothing is fixed, everything is ever changing. Through what? Through not structure, but human action. This concept of reification links into some of Marx's discussion on what is translated into English as alienation, but it does not give economic production, interaction with external nature the same central role it has in much of Marx's writing. Okay? In Western Marxism, then, what appear as structures as are simply the products of human action, in contradistinction with structuralism. Okay? For structuralists, okay, what appears as human agencies, what appears to us as human agencies, okay, are simply the products of structures. That is why it is relational. Okay. In Western Marxism, what appear as structures as are simply the products of human action, or even more simply a form of human action which has taken on a life of its own and now appears quasi natural. Let me give you some example. Suppose certain institutions, they appear to us as very much natural, given, fixed, universal, eternal, and so on. Okay? Namely the state, religion, market, and so on. Why I am giving you these three things? Because when I say state, I mean it is a political institution. When I say religion, it may be a social, cultural, and religious institution. Market refers to an economic institution. Okay. They may appear to us as universal or eternal social forms, social realities, but they are not. The state also changes, religion also changes, market also changes. The kind of market, the kind of religion, the kind of religious practices, the kind of the state that we witnessed 100 years back, they are no longer there. And what we witness today, the kind of state, the forms of religion, the forms of religious practices, the forms of religious practice, and also the forms of state, they are also not going to be there after 50, 100 years. They are ever changing, they are not static categories. Okay? That is why they only appear to us as universal, fixed, given, natural, eternal, and so on, but actually they are not. They just appear to us as quasi natural or natural. Okay? In this sense, if they are partial, then what about the totality or holism? If they are partial, okay? Then a term which is sometimes used to characterize this view of society is that of expressive totality. Okay? What is that expressive totality? I mean the social whole, the totality is seen simply as the self expression of the social subject, a self expression and self creation which we only partially recognize as such. Okay? Within a Marxist framework, okay, within a Marxist framework, the force of the word expressive, okay, if you look at this expressive, okay, this term within a Marxist framework, the force of the word expressive comes from the implication that Lukács in particular does not recognize the importance of material needs and interaction with nature in this process, so that the self creation of society is instrumental rather than expressive. This point could, however, equally be directed at Gramsci, for example, whose complete subordination of the natural world to the social, social relations of production, leads to the implication that needs are not just socially defined, but in fact socially created. For Althusser, suppose what we discussed in structuralism, that who of course throws the notion of human needs out of court, or even in some slightly convoluted arguments at Marx, the arc materialist. This is not just a problem with, of course, Marxism, given that pure biological needs are never manifested directly in human beings, but are always, I mean, these pure biological needs are always articulated in a social context, and given a socially meaningful form, the argument that we can disentangle pure biological needs from the social form, from the social constitute or from the social form, they always take is a problematic one. Of course, it's a necessary one, although it is a necessary one. Okay. Now then, if we just look at these discourses, okay, what we come to know that we are trying to recapitulate whatever we have discussed today in this lecture. That we started with Western Marxist, I mean the module on Western Marxism or Western Marxist perspectives on critical modernist paradigm in sociology, and there we tried to encapsulate, capture the meaning of Western Marxism, though there are certain differences, and the differences between structuralism and Western Marxism we have discussed. We have, I mean, through the works of Lukács and Gramsci, particularly Turenne will come a little while later in the next lecture. Okay. And we have discussed the similarity between Lukács and Gramsci. Lukács was very much engaged in the Hungarian Revolution of 1919, whereas Gramsci was very much involved in the Workers' Council movement during the Turin strikes in Italy. Okay. And Turenne, of course, was very much engaged, was very much investigating the experience of car workers at Renault in the 1950s. He was involved with the students' movements in 1968, and also engaged in the anti-nuclear movement in France. Thus, there is a common thread of involvement with social movements and the refusal to separate theory from practice with all these three thinkers. Okay. Then we have discussed the differences between structuralism and Marxism against the backdrop of the concept of totality. Okay. Okay. Then we have discussed reification and alienation. I mean, reification refers to the process where the result of our actions appear to us as a quasi-natural thing, because we do not recognize its social origins or the process of creation that goes into its formation. Okay. And this concept of reification is related to some of Marx's discussion on what is translated into English as alienation or human alienation. We have discussed. We have also discussed that how the concept of reification, of course, I mean, the concept of alienation of course gives primacy to economic production, interaction with external nature, and so on, whereas reification of course does not give economic production, interaction with external nature, and so on, the central role it has in much of Marx's writings. Okay. In Western Marxism, then what appear as structures are simply the products of human action or human agency, or even more simply a form of human action which has taken on a life of its own and now appears quasi natural. That is why I said nothing is natural, given or fixed or universal or eternal in the Western Marxist tradition, in the Western Marxist theoretical trajectory. Okay. That is why I gave you the examples of state, religion and market and so on. Then we have discussed expressive totality. Okay. I mean, the social whole, the totality is often seen simply as the self expression of the social subject, not only the self expression of the social subject, but also a self expression and self creation which can only which we can only partially recognize as such. Okay. And in this and within what we have also discussed how within a Marxist framework the force of the word expressive comes from the implication that Lukács in particular does not recognize the importance of material needs and interaction with nature in this process, so that the self creation of society is instrumental rather than expressive. This point could however equally be directed at Gramsci, whose complete subordination of the natural world to the social leads to the implication that needs are not just socially defined, but in fact socially created. And in the next lecture we are going to discuss social movements and reflexivity and rationality. Within social movements we are going to discuss human agency, and class conflicts, class consciousness, class organization, I mean hegemony, okay, knowledge and action in social movements. And in reflexivity and rationality we are going to discuss self creation, self knowledge and modernity, I mean the historicity part and absolute historicism. Okay. Thank you.